All right, so we are going to be focusing on a question that I find to be really pivotal just to web application development, and that is what items should I sanitize from the application's logs, right? And we're going to be going into yes, we shouldn't be basically we should be sanitizing passwords out of the logs, right? But I'm also just going to be kind of thinking about some other edge cases. And the item here is really not to have an incredibly uh, basically a comprehensive, course of every single item that you should sanitize out of the application logs. I'll give some links for that can help with that. But more of just kind of a survey, just to kind of understand the different items that could be kind of everyday kind of risks and such. So anyhow, taking a step back a little bit and just going to make a little bit of an analogy here as it relates to application logs. So, in physical reconnaissance, when somebody's trying to scope out a physical location, right? I read this book called Social Engineering: The Art of Human Hacking. And basically, the guy who wrote the book is he just said something like, "I can't wait to jump into a company's dumpster. I can't wait." And, like he was just so stoked to jump in that thing. And, I'll never forget that. I was in the car and I was listening to it on Audible, and I was just laughing out loud, right? And his whole thing was is just rushed employees don't shred documents, and he's just like, you will not believe what is in that dumpster, right? So yeah, hey, one man's junk is another man's treasure, right? He was just headfirst into that dumpster every time. So for me, I mean, so thinking about that relative to application logs, really we can think of the application logs as the application's dumpster, and it's a common attack target, right? And why is that? I mean, rush devs or DevOps engineers don't shred sensitive information, right? Or they don't sanitize sensitive information basically within the logs, okay? So let's think of some potential ways that items can get leaked into the logs, right? And one of these is username issues, right? So user accidentally enters their password into the username field, okay? So how would this look within the logs? Like I have seen this so many times, right? And okay, so username Ronald McDonald, password 123 doesn't exist, and then username Ronald McDonald logged in successfully. Obviously, through seeing this sequence in the logs that in these items usually occur one after the other, it's kind of you can see what Ronald McDonald's password really is. I'm kind of surprised it wasn't Grimace or what it Birdie or whoever Ronald's little friends are. But anyhow, sorry, I was just thinking about Ronald when I wrote this. So anyhow, so here's the thing. Now here's the question, right? How do we deal with this? And the solution we might see is kind of might be a little bit obvious once you see it, but kind of when you see it this way, it might not be so evident just within the log view. So it's kind of cool to be able to critically think about it just as you would see it within the logs, right? So how should we deal with this? And so we'll kind of go through this before we actually see the solution. So all right, so let's think about it. How should we deal with this, right? Do we sanitize all usernames from the logs? Huh. I mean, I would argue no, right? And the item here is incident response, right? We need some way, I mean, just some kind of audit trail to see, who's trying to log in, etc. And basically, the item is finding a trade-off. Maybe there's a super simple, solution that can deal with this, right? And the solution is, I mean, is server side validation and client side validation, but the server side is this. Okay, so if a server receives a username with no password, right? We go ahead and just abort the request. We don't query the database, right? And then we do not log the username at all if there's no password there. And we can go ahead and log the IP for bot or denial of service activity. So Obviously, you'd want to do some client-side validation here as well. So don't send the request if there's no password. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, right? So that's it's kind of obvious. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's obvious within this context, but just seeing it within the log view, it might not have been like, oh, well, there's just a super easy, elegant way to deal with this that isn't just, hey, let's just sanitize all usernames out of the logs, right? So yeah, so there's a potential solution there. So what about credentials within log files, right? Obviously, we don't want to be like a user's password within a forum post, right? We don't want to be logging that. And I'm sure, pretty much most of you already do that, like don't, persist that into the logs and know better, right? But I'm just putting it here just more to illustrate a point yeah. Anyhow, moving on. So, so connection strings with basic auth. So, but here is one that I commonly see certain developers don't really think about, right? So database connection strings usually can be done with basic authentication. I've seen, say like authenticating, say an app, server into like a Mongo database, right? And I commonly see items like this within the logs, right? Connection to the actual connection string succeeded, right? And that connection string actually contains the username and password, right? So for the fix, really set up some logging middleware within your app. I mean, you basically should already have some logging middleware, but you can extend it to sanitize out certain items, right? So you could create a regex that looked for a basic pattern, right? This is not a regex pattern, but you could just look at the pattern right here and then create a regex from it, right? That just sanitizes out just basic auth, and then you can go ahead and replace it with literally a string literal that just says sanitized and like caps, right? Just so if you're auditing this later, you can see, oh, like my this was sanitized out. The other item is just for basically credentials and log files or script output is really, I see this within Jenkins a lot. So basically, a build script's occurring, and sometimes it actually there's like the debugging flag, say within Bash, has been set. So basically, all the say say if you're setting a variable, right, that was previously, like, say it was set, and say you all right, let me just take a step back. Say you had some credentials that were set in another place that was not within the build script, yet you were leveraging basically the debugging functionality within Bash. So even though the actual credentials aren't being stored within a given build script file, because the debugging output is on, you can actually see those variable assignments, and it can actually show and leak the credentials because it shows the actual variable assignment for a given, say like a sensitive like environment variable that you're assigning to a variable within your build script, right? So that's just something just to be aware of, is the debugging output. Also, uh, yes, I mean, shouldn't be storing kind of sensitive credentials within build scripts, but this does happen a lot. So I would say, and so it's easy for this to be seen within, kind of build script output. So for me, just kind of suggests the Jenkins credentials plugin. Also, you can look into centralized secret management, right? So say it's like basically an outside server that is not within like that's not within Jenkins. It can be like HashiCorp's Vault, AWS's Secret Manager, etc. These are outside places that you put your secrets in, and then you can make calls in the Bash script to fetch the credentials and then assign them to a variable. And that's why you don't have that debugging output on, because if you did, then it would show that variable assignment and leak the credentials. So those are just some ideas there for especially for Jenkins or any kind of build server. So here's a fascinating one, right? Is sanitizing logs for XSS, right? And basically, to take a step back, it's like, what is XSS or cross-site scripting? Cross-site scripting is really essentially an attacker places malicious JavaScript in the victim's browser, right? And that could just to be to steal an authentication cookie, right? And then send that to an attacker-controlled domain from that malicious JavaScript, right? So how can the logs be an XSS risk, right? So basically a flow can be like this. So malicious guy signs up for a service with the username of this. So this is literally the username. Then the log gets sent to the admin UI, and the log view is something like this, right? Username, and then you actually have this malicious payload here logged in. And the admin views the logs, and the admin browser interprets that HTML, right, as literal HTML, and loads the auth cookie stealer. Okay, so basically what we would need is something to sanitize out these kind of special HTML characters so the browser would not interpret this as HTML and load in that XSS payload. So basically that's part of what we're going to be talking about within the solution, right? So basically that is this. How can we do that? Through, well, one of the best XSS modules I've seen, especially for Node.js, is literally just called XSS, right? And it's also a CLI tool. And the great thing is you can go ahead and escape all HTML tags within a given document, or you can just give certain like a tag whitelist. So you can be like, oh, only allow like paragraph tags or whatnot. So it's actually it's very powerful. So let's actually look at an example of the script tag escaping, right? So that is right here. So what we can see is this is great, and you can see the website where you can check out this module. But you can type any HTML here, right? And here it's filtering out basically the script tag. And in this implementation, the script tag isn't in the whitelist, and you can see it after it goes through the XSS filter. You can see it basically being escaped. And how does that look in the browser? Basically, so you can see it right here. So it actually physically renders due to these, due to the escaping, and doesn't have any special meaning for the browser. So yeah, so that's kind of so that's that. So, what are my recommendations? Well, really, for logs, nothing should be in that whitelist, right? And you can look into, just that module just has a simple kind of preferences kind of item. You just don't put anything in that whitelist. And for auditing, you're going to want to escape instead of removing tags. So what we saw on that previous screen, what we saw the less than and greater than, just kind of, the ampersand, LT item, that's actually, we're escaping it instead of actually removing the tags altogether. And I recommend the escaping just because you can see now you have an audit trail, right? And that audit trail can actually, I'll actually just go back. This is what I'm talking about right here. So you would see these in the log, so you would just know that somebody was trying to perform an XSS attack on your application, rather than just taking out everything regarding the script tag in general. So. Yeah, so that's that. Okay, so here is another item that I see a lot as well, and this can have some compliance implications as well. So it's really sanitizing logs for sensitive URL parameters, right? And these are just leaked everywhere. So think about this, like what's if a user submits, say, like an admin submits a query for users of a given social security number, right? Sometimes that can come up within basically like the URL parameters, right? And those can just be directly logged, right? But that's very sensitive information, right? And think about this, like often logs are just stored unencrypted. This could be a huge compliance violation of, for example, HIPAA, etc. I mean, or also think of health conditions, right? Think of if somebody's searching for or disclosing something about a health condition of theirs, right? And that is reflected within like URL parameters, right? And those are going into the logs, right? Just as a simple GET request. Once again, if you need to have some kind of compliance, that could be in huge kind of a huge problem. So the other thing is with authentication cookies stored within URL parameters. Okay, so certain frameworks will actually automatically put session IDs, or in other words, auth information, in URL parameters if cookies are turned off. Okay, so that can be a big deal. So for your given framework, search if this functionality is kind of enabled, right? And then you can kind of see what that query string parameter would be, and then you can go ahead and sanitize it, right? And if you needed to do session tracking, right, and say the only way that you could do that is via some kind of session ID that's, say, within a URL parameter or something like that, go ahead and hash the session before persisting it to the logs. Then you should have a unique identifier across all of the a user's requests that you can do. Then you can keep doing like some correlation on it. Okay, so it's just kind of a way to get around that, right? Just hashing the session. Okay, so Nginx considerations. This is huge, right? Because so your app might be going ahead and logging GET requests, post requests, and as a developer, you have direct control over the logging as such. But think about the where your app sits in the overall ecosystem, right? Of wherever you work or just whatever infrastructure you're a part of, right? So it's like Nginx logs, right? Those GET requests are probably persisted in there. So you would need to talk to, say DevOps folks or whoever deals with those servers and be like, hey, we have some sensitive items within, query string parameters that are coming in, and we can't directly take them out because this is a super old, like legacy application. So let's just get these. We need to make sure that these are sanitized out of the logs, right? So that, I mean, ultimately the best practices is to if anything of sensitive nature should be within a post request, right? And basically the usually post request bodies in a lot of places aren't logged in such a verbose way relative to say like GET, like a GET request, right? So ideal situation, put all sensitive items within into the post body. But if you can't, you need to start thinking about sanitizing some of those query string parameters out, and you need to talk to people within the whole chain of where a request comes in to your organization to make sure that those people are aware of this and sanitizing those items out as well. Whoo! All right. Okay, we got through it. All right. Okay. So additional resources for a I think that this kind of module was like a good um, basically idea to kind of get your creative juices flowing about logs in general, right? But if you want to go start really going down the rabbit hole, check out OWASP, the logging cheat sheet, and also the OWASP security logging project. You can definitely check it out. So anyhow, I really appreciate you tuning in, and I'll see you next time.